Hey guys, tonight let's do the sensible thing. Dim the lights, put the phone face down, let the room go quiet, in that way where you can almost hear the electricity in the walls doing its job. You don't need to learn anything important tonight. You don't need to remember names or dates. This is one of those stories you just let wash over you, like background static from a very judgmental past. Because tonight, we're talking about an object that existed for one very specific reason: to make people stop talking. Or, more accurately, to make women stop talking. Which, historically speaking, has always been a hobby for certain types of men with too much authority and not enough hobbies. This is the history of the scold's bridle, sometimes called the branks, sometimes called the gossip's bridle. A device that answers the question no one asked: what if misogyny but artisanal ironwork? Now, don't worry, we're not doing horror, we're not doing gore. This is sleepy history. Flat, slow, mildly depressing. Like a cloudy afternoon in a Scottish town, where everyone pretends not to notice what's happening in the market square. The scold's bridle first starts appearing in written records around the late medieval period, mostly in Scotland and northern England, which makes sense because if you're inventing a public humiliation device, you want weather that already feels emotionally hostile. The basic idea was simple, and by simple I mean cruel in that very bureaucratic way. It was an iron cage fitted over the head, sometimes hinged, sometimes locked with a little padlock just to add that extra layer of commitment. Inside, there was often a flat plate or spike designed to sit in the mouth. Not to kill, not to maim, just to make speaking uncomfortable enough that silence felt like cooperation. And the name tells you everything. A scold was not a criminal. A scold was not a traitor. A scold was not even particularly dangerous. A scold was a woman who talked too much, or too loudly, or too angrily, or at the wrong time, or to the wrong person, or simply existed in a way that annoyed her neighbors, which, if you've ever lived near other humans, you'll know is an extremely flexible definition. In medieval and early modern Europe, speech was power. Who got to speak in public mattered. Who got to complain mattered. And women, especially poor women, were expected to absorb discomfort quietly. If they didn't, if they argued, gossiped, accused, or shouted back, they could be labeled a scold. And once that label stuck, the community felt very justified in correcting the issue. Correction, in this case, meant public correction. The bridle wasn't used in private. That would defeat the point. This was a performance. The woman would be paraded through the streets or made to stand in a public place, sometimes tethered with a rope, sometimes escorted by an official whose job description definitely didn't include empathy. The message wasn't just "you talk too much." It was "we are all watching you be punished for it." And here's where the story gets quietly exhausting, because the records rarely tell us much about the women themselves. We get names sometimes, occasionally an age, almost never their side of the story. Instead, we get the complaints. She is a common scold. She is contentious. She disturbs the peace. Which could mean anything from yelling at a neighbor over a fence to publicly accusing someone of wrongdoing, or again, just being difficult in a society that really preferred women to be decorative and silent. One of the earliest surviving examples of a scold's bridle is said to date from the 16th century in Scotland. It's still preserved in museums today, usually mounted on clean white walls, lit dramatically as if it's an interesting hat choice rather than a symbol of social control. The craftsmanship is often commented on: the rivets, the hinges, the way it fits a human skill with unsettling precision. People love craftsmanship. It makes everything feel less horrifying. And Scotland really leaned into this. Town records from places like Edinburgh and Glasgow mention women being punished with the branks for scolding, slandering, or just being generally disruptive, which is historians speak for "she annoyed someone important." The punishment wasn't necessarily long, sometimes just an hour or two, but it didn't need to be. The humiliation did most of the work. And England followed a similar path, though the English legal system was a bit more chaotic about it, because England always liked to pretend it was more civilized while doing the same things with slightly different paperwork. English courts used other punishments too, like the ducking stool, which was exactly what it sounds like and exactly as subtle. The bridle was just one tool in a broader cultural toolkit designed to keep women in line, literally. And what's important here is that this wasn't some fringe practice. This wasn't a rogue sadist in a village somewhere. This was socially sanctioned. Town councils paid for these devices. Blacksmiths were commissioned to make them. There are surviving invoices. Imagine being the guy who forges one of these, hands it over, and goes home thinking, well, that's another productive day. History is full of those guys. Religion, of course, had opinions. The Bible has plenty to say about women, speech, and obedience, and none of it leans towards let her vent. Preachers often framed scolding as sinful, a disorder of the tongue, a sign of moral failure. So punishing it wasn't cruelty, it was correction, love but with iron. And then there's gossip, the great unspoken fear. Gossip was dangerous because it traveled, it undermined authority, it spread accusations, and since women were often excluded from formal power, informal networks were all they had. So controlling speech was a way to control influence. If you can't stop people from thinking, at least you can make them afraid to talk. The scold's bridle also shows up in Germany and other parts of continental Europe, though sometimes under different names. The concept remained the same: silence as virtue, loudness as vice, and always, always gendered. Men could shout, men could argue, men could duel over insults. Women, meanwhile, were expected to swallow frustration and call it grace. What makes this especially sleepy in a depressing way is how normalized it all was. There were no dramatic debates about whether this was ethical, no philosophical treatises questioning the morality of locking someone's mouth shut. It was just another line item in municipal discipline, like cleaning the streets, or regulating bread prices, or making sure women knew their place. And of course, not every woman punished with the bridle was actually loud. Some were widows, some were poor, some were already marginal. Being labeled a scold was often less about behavior and more about vulnerability. If you had no powerful family to defend you, if you were already inconvenient, the accusations stuck faster. There are cases where women were punished repeatedly, because once you're known as a scold, everything you say is proof that you are one. It's a very efficient system. You protest, and that becomes evidence. You stay silent, and that becomes submission. Either way, the system wins. By the 17th century, the scold's bridle had become a familiar symbol. Artists depicted it, writers referenced it casually. It was understood, a threat that didn't need explanation, which is usually how you know something is deeply embedded in a culture. And yet, like all things, it eventually started to feel old-fashioned. Enlightenment ideas crept in. Concepts like individual rights and human dignity began to circulate, slowly, unevenly, and mostly for men first. Public punishments started to seem crude, not wrong exactly, just embarrassing, which is often how progress begins. By the 18th century, the use of the bridle declined, not vanished, declined. It lingered in some areas longer than others, like a bad habit everyone pretended they'd quit. Eventually, it was replaced by fines, imprisonment, or just good old-fashioned social shunning. Less visible, less theatrical, still effective. Today, the scold's bridle sits behind glass, labeled, contextualized, described in neutral museum language, an instrument used to punish disorderly speech, which is one way to put it. Another way would be a reminder that silence has often been enforced, not chosen. But don't wake up yet.
we're not done, because the bridal is just the beginning. It's one object in a long tradition of policing voices, especially women's voices. And as we drift onward, we're going to float gently through how this mindset evolved, how it spread, and how it quietly reshaped societies in ways we're still untangling today. Nothing sudden is going to happen. History has already done the worst of it, and now it's just explaining itself slowly, like it always does when it's sure you can't stop it. By the time the scold's bridle began slipping out of fashion, the idea behind it didn't disappear, it just put on cleaner clothes. Because history loves rebranding. The problem was no longer that women talked too much. The problem was that they lacked decorum, or modesty, or feminine restraint. Much nicer words, same outcome. As public punishments started to feel a bit gauche, especially to people who liked calling themselves enlightened, control shifted indoors. Less iron, more expectations. Instead of strapping something onto your head, society preferred to strap it into your upbringing, which, frankly, lasts longer. The early modern period brought a rise in conduct manuals, books written mostly by men for women, explaining how to exist correctly, how to speak, when to smile while not speaking, how much opinion was acceptable before it became a personality flaw. These books were wildly popular, which should tell you everything you need to know about the anxieties of the time. Women were told that silence was a virtue, literally, not metaphorically. Silence meant chastity. Silence meant obedience. Silence meant you weren't threatening anyone's authority by accident. Talking too much, on the other hand, suggested moral looseness. A wandering tongue was only a short walk from a wandering soul, because of course it was. And this is where things get especially interesting in a very slow, sleepy way, because the punishment for speech didn't vanish. It just became social. Reputation replaced iron. Shame replaced locks. If a woman spoke out of turn, she wasn't dragged to the market square anymore. She was whispered about, avoided, labeled difficult, emotional, unstable, which, as punishments go, are harder to document but much easier to sustain. The word scold itself began to fade, but its meaning lived on in new disguises. A woman who argued was shrill. A woman who complained was ungrateful. A woman who persisted was hysterical. That last one would really have a moment later on, but we're not rushing. There's no need to rush into Freud tonight. Legal systems adapted too. Courts became less interested in overtly punishing speech, but more interested in maintaining order. Slander laws, defamation, public nuisance, all neutral on paper, all applied very selectively in practice. Men accused men in print, women accused men verbally. Guess which one was taken more seriously. And let's pause here for a second and just appreciate how tiring this all sounds, because it was. Constant self-monitoring, measuring tone, choosing words carefully, deciding whether something was worth the consequences. This was the real legacy of the scold's bridle. Not the iron itself, but the habit of silence it trained into communities. By the 18th century, the Enlightenment was in full swing. Philosophers talked endlessly about reason, liberty, and the rights of man. And yes, they did mean man. Women frequently mentioned as moral guardians of the home, which is history's way of saying, you matter, but only privately. Public speech was still dangerous territory. Even as literacy increased and women began writing more, their voices were expected to be gentle, agreeable, and apologetic. Female authors often framed their work as accidental, a hobby, something done despite their better judgment, because ambition in a woman was still unsettling. Better to pretend the words slipped out by mistake. And yet, women kept talking, quietly, strategically, in letters, in salons, in diaries, in kitchens, in places where authority wasn't looking too closely, which is probably why authority stayed so jumpy about it. Silence, it turns out, is hard to enforce forever. The Industrial Revolution didn't help. When people moved into cities, communities got louder, crowded, argumentative. Women worked, organized, complained, which was rude, frankly, given how much effort had gone into training them not to. Moral panic followed. It always does. Victorian society doubled down on the ideal of the quiet woman, angel in the house, soft-spoken, self-sacrificing, emotionally supportive but intellectually restrained. And if a woman failed to meet that ideal, there were still consequences. Not iron consequences, medical ones. This is where we gently drift into the age of diagnosis, when speech became a symptom. Hysteria was the favorite label, a convenient explanation for any behavior that didn't fit the script. Too emotional, too opinionated, too loud. The cure, of course, was rest, silence, isolation, sometimes literal confinement. The bridle had evolved, but it was still doing its job. And again, this wasn't fringe science, it was mainstream. Doctors wrote papers, institutions were built, treatments were prescribed, all based on the assumption that women's minds were delicate and easily overstimulated by, among other things, their own thoughts expressed out loud. Public life remained hostile. Women who spoke at rallies, wrote political tracts, or advocated for reform were mocked relentlessly. Cartoons depicted them as shrieking, unfeminine, unnatural. The accusation was always the same. They talked too much. They should be quiet. And when women began campaigning for rights, especially the right to vote, the language sharpened. Suffragists were called scolds, shrews, nags. Old words resurfaced with new urgency. The fear was ancient. If women spoke collectively, things might change, and that was unacceptable. What's remarkable is how persistent the imagery was. Even without physical devices, the idea of silencing remained vivid. Metaphors of muzzles, of bridles, of restraints. Language remembered what iron had taught it. By the early 20th century, legal equality crept forward in some places. Women gained the vote, entered professions, spoke publicly. And yet, the backlash never really stopped. It just adjusted. Criticism focused on tone, delivery, likability. Always the same underlying discomfort with women who refused to stay quiet. And this is where the scold's bridle becomes less of a historical artifact and more of a ghost. Because while no one is forging iron cages anymore, the instinct to police speech hasn't gone anywhere. It's just quieter, more polite, easier to deny. Museums display bridles as curiosities now, something shocking but distant, something safely past. And visitors shake their heads and feel grateful, which is fair, but also a little incomplete, because the impulse behind the object didn't vanish. It learned better manners. It learned how to sound reasonable. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Not the iron, not the humiliation, but the smooth transition from physical punishment to social expectation, from public spectacle to private restraint, the way control can soften without ever loosening. So, as we let this part drift to a close, just notice how tired history sounds when it repeats itself. Different centuries, same concerns. Same anxiety about who gets to speak and how loudly and without permission. By the time we reach the modern world, the scold's bridle no longer exists as a functioning object. No town council is commissioning one. No blacksmith is hammering out a fresh iron cage while humming to himself. And yet, the idea behind it never actually left. It just became so ordinary that it stopped needing a name. Silence, after all, works best when people enforce it on themselves. In the 20th century, speech became a right on paper. Laws changed, constitutions expanded. Women could vote, publish, protest, and speak publicly without being legally punished for the act itself, which was, objectively, a massive improvement over being locked into iron headgear in front of your neighbors. Progress deserves at least that acknowledgement. But social habits tend to outlive legal reform with a comfortable margin. The language softened. That's the first thing to notice. No one said scold anymore. That sounded medieval. Instead, the vocabulary updated. A woman who spoke firmly was aggressive. A woman who persisted was difficult. A woman who refused to soften her tone was unpleasant. None of these words came with an instruction manual, but everyone seemed to know when to apply them. And unlike the bridle, these labels didn't require witnesses. They traveled quietly, through workplaces, families, media, a raised eyebrow, a comment on tone, a suggestion to smile. The old lesson remained intact: speak carefully or pay socially. What's interesting is how often the punishment was framed as concern. People weren't trying to silence women, they insisted. They were trying to help them be more effective, more palatable, more likable. Because apparently being heard was conditional on being agreeable. And this is where the story becomes less about history and more about inertia. Cultural memory doesn't need museums. It lives in habits, in reflexes, in the way criticism is distributed unevenly and then explained away as coincidence. Even as women became more visible in public life, the scrutiny intensified. Politicians, journalists, activists. Their words were analyzed not just for content, but for delivery. Too emotional, too cold, too loud, too quiet, too much, never quite right. The iron had vanished, but the measuring never stopped. Media played its part. Talkative women were comedic. Loud women were punchlines. Angry women were warnings. And the joke was always the same, just told with better lighting. This isn't how a woman should sound. And men, of course, were rarely described this way. Their anger was passion. Their persistence was strength. Their volume was authority, which made the contrast feel natural rather than constructed. That's how these things survive, by feeling normal. The workplace inherited the bridle without ever acknowledging it. Women were advised to speak up, but not too much. To be confident, but not intimidating. To assert themselves, but gently. Feedback often centered on communication style rather than competence, as if speech itself remained the real issue. And when women pointed this out, well, that was talking too much about talking too much. A recursive problem. Very inconvenient. The internet complicated things further. On one hand, it gave everyone a platform. On the other, it amplified backlash. Women who spoke publicly online learned very quickly what visibility cost: harassment, threats, dismissal. The accusation was still there, humming beneath it all. Why are you talking? Who asked you? The mechanisms changed, but the emotional logic stayed intact. Silence equals safety. Visibility invites punishment. What's striking is how rarely the scold's bridle itself is mentioned in these conversations. It's treated as an artifact of a crueler age, something we've evolved beyond. And in a narrow technical sense, that's true. No one is being paraded through town squares with iron cages anymore. But history isn't just about what we stop doing. It's about what we replace it with. The bridle worked because it was public, because it made an example, because it taught everyone watching to adjust their behavior preemptively. Modern silence works the same way, only now the examples are viral. The lesson spreads faster. And unlike iron, social punishment leaves no rust, no physical evidence, nothing to mount on a museum wall with a placard explaining how barbaric it was, which makes it easier to deny, easier to forget, easier to repeat. This isn't to say nothing has changed. Things have, dramatically. Women speak now in ways that would have been unthinkable centuries ago. They lead, they publish, they challenge. The fact that this story can even be told openly is proof of that. But the ghost remains. In jokes, in advice, in warnings disguised as kindness. In the persistent idea that speech, especially female speech, needs managing. And that's the quiet legacy of the scold's bridle. Not the iron, not the pain, but the normalization of restraint. The expectation that some voices should be smaller, softer, easier to ignore. History rarely ends cleanly. It just fades into habits we stop questioning. The bridle didn't disappear. It dissolved into language, into etiquette, into standards that feel neutral until you look too closely. So when we look back at that iron cage behind museum glass, it's tempting to feel relieved, to think, thankfully, we don't do that anymore. And we don't. Not exactly. But the instinct to control who speaks, how they speak, and how much space they're allowed to take is still very much alive, just better dressed, better defended, more polite about it. And that's where this story settles. Not with a dramatic ending, not with a lesson neatly tied up, just with the understanding that some histories don't conclude. They linger, quietly, waiting to be noticed.
We're talking about what happened in cities after the sun went down in the 1500s, specifically the night watchman, the man whose job description was basically stand outside in the dark and hope nothing terrible happens. Now, if you live in a modern city, nighttime is when things really get going. Restaurants light up, streets glow, people wander around pretending they're not tired. In the 1500s, nighttime meant something else entirely. It meant danger. It meant suspicion. It meant that if you were out after dark, you either had a very good reason or no sense of self-preservation whatsoever. Cities back then did not gently transition into night. They shut down. Shops closed early, doors were bolted, windows were covered, fires were banked. Candles were rationed like emotional support animals. Darkness wasn't romantic. It was expensive, inconvenient, and deeply untrustworthy. And once the sun disappeared, the city belonged to a very small group of people. Criminals, drunkards, lost travelers, the occasionally confused noble, and of course the night watchman. These were not elite professionals. They were not chosen for bravery, athleticism, or even basic enthusiasm. They were often older men, injured veterans, or citizens who couldn't afford to say no. Sometimes they were appointed, sometimes they were drafted, sometimes they were just there. Think less heroic guardian and more man with a stick who would rather be asleep. Most cities across Europe had some version of the night watch by the 1500s. London had them, Paris had them, Italian cities had them, German cities took them extremely seriously, because of course they did. Each place had its own rules, but the general idea was the same. Once night fell, a group of watchmen would patrol the streets. They carried lanterns, halberds, or staves, keys, bells, or rattles, and they walked, slowly, very slowly. They weren't chasing criminals or solving mysteries. They were observing, listening, announcing the time, and mostly trying not to fall asleep while standing upright. In London, the watch would often call out the hours as they passed, "All's well," which was less a statement of fact and more a hopeful suggestion. They would shout the time, the weather, and occasionally a reminder that fires were bad and you should really double-check your candles, because fire was the real enemy of the night. Early modern cities were made of wood, straw, pitch, and optimism, and a single unattended flame could turn an entire neighborhood into a glowing memory by morning. So the watchmen were also fire monitors. They peered into windows, sniffed the air, knocked on doors if something looked suspiciously warm, and yes, people absolutely hated that. Imagine trying to sleep after a long day of medieval labor only to have a man with a lantern tap your window because your candle vibes felt off. Not relaxing, but necessary. The watchmen also enforced curfews. Many cities require. We're talking about what happened in cities after the sun went down in the 1500s, specifically the night watchman, the man whose job description was basically
stand outside in the dark and hope nothing terrible happens. Now, if you live in a modern city, nighttime is when things really get going. Restaurants light up, streets glow, people wander around pretending they're not tired. In the 1500s, nighttime meant something else entirely. It meant danger. It meant suspicion. It meant that if you were out after dark, you either had a very good reason or no sense of self-preservation whatsoever. Cities back then did not gently transition into night. They shut down. Shops closed early, doors were bolted, windows were covered, fires were banked. Candles were rationed like emotional support animals. Darkness wasn't romantic. It was expensive, inconvenient, and deeply untrustworthy. And once the sun disappeared, the city belonged to a very small group of people. Criminals, drunkards, lost travelers, the occasionally confused noble, and of course the night watchman. These were not elite professionals. They were not chosen for bravery, athleticism, or even basic enthusiasm. They were often older men, injured veterans, or citizens who couldn't afford to say no. Sometimes they were appointed, sometimes they were drafted, sometimes they were just there. Think less heroic guardian and more man with a stick who would rather be asleep. Most cities across Europe had some version of the night watch by the 1500s. London had them, Paris had them, Italian cities had them, German cities took them extremely seriously, because of course they did. Each place had its own rules, but the general idea was the same. Once night fell, a group of watchmen would patrol the streets. They carried lanterns, halberds, or staves, keys, bells, or rattles, and they walked, slowly, very slowly. They weren't chasing criminals or solving mysteries. They were observing, listening, announcing the time, and mostly trying not to fall asleep while standing upright. In London, the watch would often call out the hours as they passed, "All's well," which was less a statement of fact and more a hopeful suggestion. They would shout the time, the weather, and occasionally a reminder that fires were bad and you should really double-check your candles, because fire was the real enemy of the night. Early modern cities were made of wood, straw, pitch, and optimism, and a single unattended flame could turn an entire neighborhood into a glowing memory by morning. So the watchmen were also fire monitors. They peered into windows, sniffed the air, knocked on doors if something looked suspiciously warm, and yes, people absolutely hated that. Imagine trying to sleep after a long day of medieval labor only to have a man with a lantern tap your window because your candle vibes felt off. Not relaxing, but necessary. The watchmen also enforced curfews. Many cities required citizens to be indoors after dark unless they had permission, and foreigners were especially suspect. If you were traveling and arrived late, congratulations, you were now a problem. If the watch found you wandering without a reason, they could detain you, which often meant dragging you to a guardhouse to sleep it off on a bench that had seen things. Night was not neutral, it was morally loaded. Darkness was associated with crime, sin, disorder, and people making questionable life choices, so the night watch was less about protection and more about control. They were there to make sure the city stayed quiet, predictable, and properly asleep. Now, let's drift to the people actually doing this job, because the system considered them replaceable and often slightly embarrassing. Being a watchman paid poorly, sometimes not at all. In some places, citizens were required to take turns serving, and if it was your night, it was your night. If you were wealthy, you could often pay someone else to take your shift, which tells you everything you need to know about how desirable the job was. As a result, many watchmen were not great. Contemporary complaints describe them as drunk, asleep, inattentive, or mysteriously absent, which is impressive considering their entire job was to be present. In London, it was a running joke that criminals feared the watch only slightly less than they feared tripping over a cobblestone. Watchmen were known to nap in doorways, lean on walls, or huddle together for warmth and moral support, and honestly, fair. They worked long hours, walked the same routes every night, and dealt with aggressive drunks, confused elders, lost children, and the occasional noble who believed rules did not apply to him, because of course he did. Nobles out at night were a special problem. In theory, everyone was subject to the same curfew laws, but in practice, a drunk aristocrat with a sword and a temper was not someone a tired watchman wanted to challenge. There are records of watchmen politely escorting nobles home while apologizing for the inconvenience of existing, and also records of watchmen being beaten, insulted, or arrested for daring to question someone with a better last name. Class hierarchy did not go to bed. Then there were the sounds. Nighttime cities were not silent, but they were different. Dogs barked, drunks sang, carts rattled. Church bells marked hours most people were trying to ignore. Watchmen learned the normal sounds of their streets, which meant they noticed when something sounded wrong. A crash, a scream, running footsteps. Sometimes it was nothing, sometimes it was very much something, but they weren't rushing in heroically. They were assessing, waiting, calling for help if things escalated beyond mild chaos. Watchmen rarely worked alone, at least not officially. They were supposed to call out to each other, use whistles or bells, and form a sleepy, confused response unit that arrived several minutes too late. Crime at night was common. Muggings, burglaries, fights, and most of them were solved the same way. They weren't.
The goal wasn't justice, it was restoration of quiet. If a fight broke out, the watch separated people. If someone was injured, they were moved elsewhere. If someone died, that became tomorrow's problem. Night belonged to the margins. Prostitutes worked then, smugglers moved then. People who didn't fit neatly into daylight society found space in the dark, and the watch was constantly negotiating that reality. In some cities, especially in Italy, watchmen were more organized. Venice, being Venice, had layered systems of guards, patrols, and water-based monitoring, checking boats, bridges, and movement between districts, deeply concerned with secrecy, espionage, and fires, because Venice was rich, paranoid, and flammable. In German cities, watchmen often had strict schedules and uniforms. They announced hours, checked gates, locked and unlocked entrances. Cities were physically closed at night, gates shut, bridges raised, and if you were outside when that happened, congratulations again, you were extremely outside. The watch controlled who got in and out, which gave them power, and with power came predictable problems. Bribery was common. Look the other way. Open the gate. Pretend you didn't see that. Not because watchmen were evil, but because they were underpaid humans operating in the dark with minimal supervision. And honestly, if someone offered you money at 2 a.m. to make your life easier, you might think about it too. Religion also shaped the night. Church authorities worried deeply about what people did after dark because night encouraged sin, temptation, and thoughts daylight politely discouraged. So watchmen sometimes enforced moral behavior, breaking up gatherings, stopping singing, questioning couples. Imagine being stopped by a man with a lantern and asked to explain your relationship status in the cold. Romantic. In some cities, women found alone at night were immediately suspect, especially poorer and unmarried women. The watch could detain them for their own protection, which often meant a holding cell and a reputation problem the next morning. Night amplified inequality, and the watch stood in the middle of it, holding a stick and trying to yawn. By the late 1500s, complaints about the night watch were everywhere. They were lazy, corrupt, ineffective, and all of that was true. But they were also the only thing standing between a sleeping city and total chaos. Without street lighting, without police forces, without rapid communication, the night watch was a compromise, a human placeholder. They represented order simply by existing, by walking, by being seen. A lantern moving through darkness told people someone was awake, someone was watching, and that alone mattered more than competence. As the century moved forward, cities experimented with more structured patrols, better pay, more accountability, and slowly the night became less frightening, less mysterious, less absolute.
But in the 1500s, darkness still ruled, and the watchmen were its tired, underappreciated negotiators. They didn't conquer the night, they endured it. And with that, we'll let them continue their slow walk down cobblestone streets, lanterns swinging gently, thoughts drifting toward dawn. Same city, same cobblestones, same cold night air that smells faintly like damp wood, old smoke, and regret. The lanterns are still flickering, the watchmen are still walking, and the sun is still very much not involved in any of this. By the 1500s, nighttime crime wasn't exactly organized, but it was persistent, mostly because night offered something incredibly rare in early modern cities: privacy. During the day, cities were loud, crowded, and deeply invested in everyone else's business. At night, shutters closed, doors locked, and suddenly there were pockets of shadow where things could happen without an audience, and people noticed. Most nighttime crimes were small: petty theft, pickpocketing, breaking into shops that definitely were not insured. The goal wasn't violence, it was speed. A thief didn't want a confrontation, they wanted a window left unlatched, a drunk man asleep on a bench, a house that smelled like money and complacency. The watch knew this, which is why so much of their patrol involved just looking, checking doors, testing locks, shining lanterns into alleys where they already knew nothing good ever happened. And if they saw someone running, they assumed guilt immediately, because why would you run at night unless you were doing something questionable? Curfews made all of this even messier, as most cities had strict rules about who could be outside after dark. Residents were expected to be home, travelers needed papers, workers had to explain themselves. So the watch spent a surprising amount of time just asking questions. Who are you? Where are you going? Why now? And if you didn't have a convincing answer, the night just got longer for you. Detention wasn't dramatic. You weren't thrown into a dungeon. You were usually parked somewhere uncomfortable until morning. A guardhouse, a gatehouse, sometimes just a locked room with a bench and a smell that suggested it had hosted many previous guests. And morning would sort it out, which sounds calm until you realize that reputations mattered. Being detained at night could follow you. Neighbors would talk, authorities would remember your name, and nighttime suspicion had consequences. Now, drift over to a specific problem that absolutely haunted the night watch: knocking. During the day, knocking on a door was normal, expected even, but at night, knocking was alarming, because a knock after sunset meant something was wrong: fire, illness, death, or someone making very poor decisions. If you knocked on the wrong door, you might be ignored, or shouted at, or reported to the watch, because opening your door at night was dangerous. You didn't know who was there or what they wanted, and the watch often responded to knocks. There are records of watchmen being called because someone was disturbing the peace by knocking too late. Which feels harsh until you remember how fragile nighttime peace actually was. Silence was security, and anything that broke it was suspicious. Fire deserves attention too. Most cities required hearth fires to be extinguished or carefully controlled at night. Candles snuffed when no longer needed, lanterns covered, and the watch checked for this by peering through windows and looking for flickering light where there shouldn't be any. If they found a violation, fines followed, sometimes confiscation, sometimes a very stern lecture delivered by a man who had been awake for 10 hours longer than he wanted to be. Fire didn't care about social class, but enforcement did. Wealthy homes were inspected gently, poorer homes thoroughly, because if a fire started, it was usually blamed on the people least able to defend themselves afterward. Despite curfews, people still met at night, quietly, carefully. Friends visited, lovers met, workers finished late shifts, and the watch tolerated some of this because they weren't monsters and understood life didn't end at sunset. But gatherings were risky. Groups meant noise meant attention, and attention meant the watch might appear, lantern first, questions ready. In some cities, singing at night was illegal. Not loud singing, any singing, because singing encouraged joy, joy led to gatherings, and gatherings led to chaos, a logic that was simple, if slightly depressing. Alcohol made everything worse. Taverns were required to close early, but enforcement was inconsistent. Some quietly kept serving after hours with shutters closed and lights dimmed. And the watch knew this, which is why taverns were frequent stops on patrol routes. Sometimes the watch shut them down, sometimes they accepted a drink and looked the other way. Underpaid humans. Drunkenness at night was one of the watch's most common problems. Drunk people fell over, argued, mistook watchmen for enemies, demons, or former co-workers, and most night arrests involved alcohol, usually ending with someone sleeping it off somewhere inconvenient. Violence did happen at night. Fights broke out, arguments escalated, but the goal was not bloodshed, it was dominance, honor. Alcohol fueled misunderstandings, and the watch responded cautiously, waiting for numbers, calling for help, sometimes arriving too late. When that happened, reports were written, witnesses questioned, but resolution was slow. Justice moved at daylight speed, and night was about containment. One of the watch's strangest responsibilities was dealing with the dead. If someone died at night, the body usually stayed where it was until morning, covered and guarded, with the watch standing nearby, lantern lit, keeping animals and curious neighbors away. Because death after dark was inconvenient. Doctors weren't available, officials weren't awake, so the watch became temporary custodians of mortality, quietly, respectfully, very tired. For the poor, night was constant exposure. Sleeping in streets, doorways, or public spaces was often illegal, but enforcement depended on mood, weather, and visibility, so the watch sometimes moved people along, sometimes ignored them, sometimes detained them, with no consistent policy, just discretion, and discretion is always uneven. Night sharpened social divisions: who belonged inside, who didn't, who deserved protection, who didn't, and the watch embodied those decisions in real time. By the late 1500s, cities began realizing the night wasn't going away. Trade expanded, travel increased, urban populations grew, and more people needed to move after dark, and the watch system was strained. Too few, too tired, too informal. Complaints piled up. Merchants wanted safer nights, authorities wanted more control, citizens wanted quieter streets, and the watch was caught in the middle. Still walking, still calling out the hours, still hoping nothing caught fire. As time drifted forward, the night would slowly change. Lighting would creep in, surveillance would grow more organized, and being outside after dark would stop being inherently suspicious. But for now, the lanterns kept swinging, the gates stayed closed, and the watch continued its endless loop through sleeping streets. By the time we reached the later 1500s, the night itself had developed a reputation, not just as darkness, but as a personality, something watchful, something slightly judgmental. People didn't just fear crime after sunset, they feared what the night might contain simply because it was the night, and the watchmen knew this. They walked through streets where every shadow felt meaningful, where every sound carried extra weight, where the absence of light made imagination do most of the work. Nighttime sounds were different from daytime sounds, not louder, just lonelier. A footstep echoed longer, a cough felt closer, a door creak sounded intentional even when it wasn't. The watch learned these sounds the way sailors learned waves. They knew which noises belonged and which ones didn't. A cat knocking something over was normal, a cart shifting in its sleep was fine. A drunk muttering to himself was expected, but a slow, deliberate step behind you earned a pause. This is where superstition quietly moved in. Early modern cities were Christian, but not calm about it. People believed deeply, sincerely, and vividly. Demons were real, spirits were possible, the dead were not always done being dead, and night was when these things had the most freedom. The watch didn't officially deal with the supernatural, but unofficially they absolutely did. There are records of watchmen reporting strange lights, unexplained sounds, figures that vanished when approached, most of which were later explained as lantern reflections, animals, or extremely tired men experiencing their third hallucination of the week. But in the moment, they felt real. Church teachings didn't help either. Sermons regularly reinforced the idea that darkness encouraged evil, that demons preferred night, that sin was easier when no one was watching, which is ironic,
considering the watch was literally watching. But belief doesn't require logic. Graveyards were especially tense places after dark, and many cities prohibited anyone from entering them at night, including the watch unless necessary. They were quiet, open, and deeply symbolic, and if something moved in a graveyard at night, people noticed. Add to this the fact that many watchmen were older, half asleep and working long shifts, and fear didn't need much encouragement. The watch developed routines partly to cope with this. They walked predictable routes, announced themselves loudly, avoided lingering too long in places that made the imagination spiral. Calling out the hour wasn't just for the city, it was for themselves. It reminded them that time was passing, that dawn would come, that the night was finite. Psychologically, the night stretched. Without artificial lighting, hours felt longer. The dark blurred edges, fatigue warped perception, and a 4-hour watch could feel endless. Boredom mixed dangerously with anxiety, which is why so many watchmen drank. Not heavily, not always publicly, but enough to take the edge off the silence. Authorities complained constantly about drunken watchmen, but they also quietly understood why it happened, because standing alone in the dark with your thoughts was not easy. Over time, cities began experimenting with solutions, small ones at first, more watchmen per shift, clearer routes, better coordination. Some cities introduced early forms of street lighting, not the glowing streets we imagine today, just a few lanterns placed at intersections or near important buildings. But even a little light changed everything. It reduced fear, reduced crime, reduced imagination. The night became less mysterious when you could see 5 feet ahead of you. Watchmen reported feeling calmer in lit areas, less jumpy, less isolated, and citizens felt it too. More people began moving after dark, carefully and quietly, and night stopped being a total shutdown and became a reduced version of day. This shift didn't happen at once. It took decades, centuries even, but the late 1500s were the beginning of the end for the truly medieval night, and the watch evolved alongside it. By the early 1600s, some cities professionalized their night patrols. Uniforms became standardized, pay improved slightly, expectations became clearer. The watch stopped being a civic punishment and became a job, not a glamorous one, but a defined one. And this also meant stricter discipline, fewer naps, fewer bribes, at least in theory. But something was lost in the process. The old watchmen knew their streets intimately. They knew who belonged where, which windows should be dark, and which lights meant trouble. As systems grew larger, that personal knowledge faded. Night became regulated, managed, measured, and fear slowly shifted away from the darkness itself. By the end of the 16th century, the night was no longer completely lawless, still dangerous, still uncertain, but no longer untouchable. The watch had done its quiet work, not heroically, not efficiently, but persistently. They bridged a gap between medieval fear and early modern control, between superstition and surveillance. They didn't defeat the night, they trained people to live with it, and that might be the most important part, because once people stop fearing the dark, they start using it. Commerce expands, social life stretches, cities grow upward and outward, and the night becomes just another space to occupy, which eventually leads us to modern cities that never really sleep at all. But none of that happens without these early watchmen, with their lanterns, their tired feet, their imperfect vigilance. They stood at the edge of sleep and order, night after night, year after year, holding the dark at bay just enough for civilization to inch forward. We're going to talk about something that sounds absolutely unhinged, but somehow became one of the oldest medical practices in human history. Yes, tonight's gentle bedtime topic is trepanning, also called trephination,
also known as Why Did Ancient Humans Think This Was a Good Idea? If you're not familiar, trepanning is the practice of drilling, scraping, or cutting a hole into a human skull. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, physically, with bone removed, the brain still inside, and the vibes questionable. And yet people did this, a lot, for thousands of years, across continents, across cultures, sometimes successfully, which is honestly the most unsettling part. So tonight we're going to slowly wander through the strange, slightly depressing, and deeply confusing history of why humans decided that when life got hard, the solution might be a hole in the head. No jump scares, no screaming, just a long, flat stroll through humanity's most persistent medical bad idea. Now get comfortable, because this story begins long before written language, back when medical school consisted of vibes, intuition, and a rock you liked. Long before kings, queens, or even cities, humans were already doing trepanning, with the earliest evidence dating back at least 7,000 to 10,000 years, depending on which archaeologist you ask and how optimistic they're feeling that day. We know this because skulls have been found, many skulls, with very deliberate holes in them, smooth edges, and signs of healing, which means yes, people survived this. And immediately your brain wants to ask why. Why would anyone do this? Who suggested it first? And why did everyone else go, yeah, sure, let's try that? The uncomfortable truth is that we don't know exactly who started it, but we do know why it kept happening. Early humans lived in a world where headaches weren't migraines, but curses. Seizures weren't neurological events, but demons having a rave. And mental illness wasn't chemical imbalance, but spirits squatting rent-free in your skull. So if someone had seizures, hallucinations, depression, anxiety, or even just a really bad personality, the explanation was simple. Something was trapped inside their head, and it needed a door. Enter trepanning. The logic, in a very calm and ancient way, made sense. If bad spirits enter through openings, then maybe they can leave through one too. It's the same logic as opening a window when your house smells weird, except the house is your skull and the smell is existential dread. Now, this wasn't always done recklessly, which somehow makes it worse, because archaeologists have found evidence that early trepanning was careful, slow, and methodical. They scraped the skull rather than smashed it, avoided penetrating the brain, used stone tools polished smooth over years, and stopped when the bone was thin enough, which suggests this wasn't panic medicine, this was routine. Imagine sitting around a fire while someone calmly explains, "Don't worry, we've done this before. Most people survive, probably." Now, let's slow down and talk about the experience itself. There was no anesthesia as we know it, no countdown, no reassuring voice saying you'll feel some pressure. Pain management involved alcohol, herbs, chewing coca leaves, or just enduring it. Patients were awake. They had to be, because you don't want someone unconscious when your medical plan is stop before you hit the brain. So imagine sitting very still while someone scrapes your skull, very patiently, very confidently, because they've done this before. And maybe they hum or talk about the weather or explain how much better you'll feel once the spirits leave. And weirdly, some patients probably did feel better afterwards, not because demons escaped, but because pressure was relieved, inflammation reduced, or placebo kicked in hard, which reinforced the practice. That's how these things survive, not because they're correct, but because they work just enough. Now, let's drift forward in time a bit. Ancient Egypt knew about trepanning, but they weren't huge fans and preferred magic, prayers, and letting things be someone else's problem. Hippocrates, the famous Greek physician, did discuss skull drilling, but only for very specific injuries, and he was cautious, which for ancient Greece counts as extremely progressive. Still, the idea stuck, and by the Middle Ages, trepanning had evolved into something more chaotic. Barber surgeons were now involved, which is never a good sign, because these were people who cut hair, pulled teeth, and occasionally opened skulls between appointments. Their tools were iron now, sharper, faster, and much less patient, and trepanning became associated with treating everything from epilepsy to insanity to "she's too loud," with women disproportionately trepanned for being inconvenient. Of course they were. There's a famous medieval illustration showing a man having a stone removed from his head, not literally but symbolically, the stone of madness, because the belief had shifted slightly, and madness wasn't just spirits anymore, but a physical object lodged in the brain, a pebble, a blockage, a bad thought refusing to leave, and the solution remained the same: whole. Now, you'd think that as medicine advanced, this would stop, but it did not, because trepanning survived into the 19th and even 20th centuries, by then with a new excuse: science. Doctors believed drilling into the skull could treat depression, schizophrenia, and anxiety by relieving pressure or improving blood flow, which sounds clinical, respectable, almost reasonable, until we remember they were still drilling holes in people's heads. One of the most infamous modern advocates was Dr. Walter Freeman, a man who looked at complex mental illness and said, "What if we were faster about this?" Popularizing lobotomies, trepanning's emotionally detached cousin, and while not exactly the same procedure, the philosophy was identical. If the brain is causing problems, change the brain, preferably with tools. Now, here's the part where things get extra strange. Trepanning never fully went away. There are modern advocates, real people living now, who believe drilling a hole in your skull improves consciousness, including one man in the 1960s who drilled his own skull with a power drill at home because, of course he did, claiming it improved mental clarity, awareness, and connection to the universe. Doctors called it dangerous, he called it enlightenment. And this is where we gently notice a pattern. Throughout history, trepanning has been less about medicine and more about control. Control over pain, fear, mental chaos, and things humans didn't understand yet. When your world is unpredictable, sometimes the illusion of action is comforting, even if that action involves a hole. So tonight, as you lie there safely unperforated, remember that your ancestors were doing their best. They just didn't have MRI machines, or therapy, or the ability to Google, "Is this a bad idea?" They had headaches, they had fear, and they had rocks. And somehow that was enough to convince them. In the next part, we'll gently drift into specific cultures, strange case studies, and some individuals who survived trepanning and lived surprisingly long lives afterward, which raises even more uncomfortable questions. But for now, let your mind slow, your thoughts drift, and your skull remain intact. Get a little more comfortable if you need to. Shift the pillow, unclench your jaw. Your skull is still doing great, no holes yet. In this part, we're going to gently wander through different ancient cultures that all, independently, looked at human suffering and arrived at the same oddly specific conclusion: what if we opened the head? Not metaphorically, physically. And what's fascinating and deeply exhausting is how calm everyone was about it. Let's begin in ancient South America because, honestly, they were the most committed. The Inca and pre-Inca civilizations of Peru were absolutely prolific trepanners. Archaeologists have found thousands of skulls with holes, not accidents, not battle damage, but intentional, carefully made openings. Some skulls show one hole, some show two, and some show so much bone regrowth that doctors can tell the patient survived for decades afterward, which suggests these weren't desperate last-ditch procedures, this was follow-up care. Imagine going back to your surgeon years later and saying, "You know what, doc? That first hole really helped. Let's do another." Now, the Andean understanding of the body was deeply spiritual, but also surprisingly practical. They believed illness came from imbalance, from blocked energies, from forces trapped where they shouldn't be. And if something was trapped, you gave it a way out. Very polite, very considerate. They used obsidian tools, sharp and precise, and cleaner than most medieval European instruments centuries later. They cleaned wounds, avoided major blood vessels, and packed the openings with medicinal plants. And here's the uncomfortable statistic. Some estimates suggest survival rates of 60 to 80%, which is better than many surgeries performed in Europe as late as the 1800s. So while it's tempting to laugh at ancient medicine, they were, frustratingly, not terrible at this. Now let's gently drift over to Africa, where trepanning also appeared independently. In parts of North and East Africa, skulls dating back thousands of years show similar practices. Again, no sign of shared instruction manuals, just humans doing human things. Here, trepanning was often associated with spiritual cleansing, headaches, seizures, possession, bad dreams, and general, this person is not vibing correctly energy. The head was sacred, the seat of the soul, and when the soul was distressed, you intervened. Sometimes trepanning was ritualized with chants, community involvement, and a sense that this wasn't just surgery, but participation in something meaningful, which is oddly comforting. If someone's going to drill your skull, at least let it be a community event. Now let's slowly wander into Europe, where things get messier. Neolithic Europe practiced trepanning extensively. France, Germany, the British Isles, skulls everywhere, holes everywhere. Some were done post-mortem, likely for ritual reasons, but many were done on living people. European trepanning seems to be a mix of spiritual belief and early medical experimentation. Head trauma from farming accidents, falls, interpersonal violence, and the ancient solution remained consistent. Open the head, relieve the pressure, and hope for the best.
As Europe moved into classical antiquity, the tone shifted. The Greeks, particularly Hippocrates, tried to be sensible. He wrote about trepanning in a way that feels almost modern, recommending it only when fractures caused pressure buildup, warning against unnecessary drilling and explaining technique, which is impressive but also slightly tragic because his caution didn't stick. The Romans inherited the knowledge, improved the tools, and then promptly ignored most of the restraint. Roman surgeons loved intervention. If something could be done, it should be done. They drilled skulls for epilepsy, for mental illness, for headaches, and for reasons that were vague. And because Romans wrote everything down, we know they were very confident about it. Confidence, as history repeatedly teaches us, is not the same as correctness. Now let's gently slide into the Middle Ages, where trepanning enters its most chaotic phase. By this point, medicine was a cocktail of ancient texts, religious doctrine, superstition, and vibes. And trepanning was still on the menu. But now it had competition: bloodletting, leeches, prayer, exorcism, and of course, doing nothing and calling it God's will. Barber surgeons became the main practitioners, men who cut hair, shaved beards, amputated limbs, and drilled skulls. Their tools were proudly displayed outside shops: bowls, knives, and sometimes skull drills, which is not the ambiance you want when asking for a haircut. Trepanning in the Middle Ages was often justified by the humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Too much of one? Hole. Epilepsy? Hole. Depression? Hole. A woman speaking too loudly? Probably a hole. And here's where it gets especially bleak. Mental illness was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized. People with seizures or hallucinations were feared, marginalized, and blamed. Trepanning became a way to fix them, not to help them, but to make them less disruptive, which is a pattern we'll see repeat, unfortunately. Now, despite all this, some medieval patients did survive, not because the procedure was good, but because humans are stubborn. Skulls healed, people adapted, life continued, and this survival reinforced belief. If they lived, it must have worked, even if the person was now quieter, slower, different. And yes,
Children were trepanned too. Infants with seizures, kids with head injuries, young people with behavioral issues. Because nothing says we love you like drilling into your developing skull. Again, survival happened, which only strengthened the practice. As we drift into the Renaissance, something interesting happens. Anatomy improves, dissections become more common, and doctors start understanding the brain as an organ, not just a container for vibes. Trepanning becomes more targeted, less spiritual, more surgical, but still very enthusiastic. It's used for skull fractures, tumors, and pressure relief. And for the first time, some doctors start questioning whether it should be used for mental illness, which is progress, tiny, slow progress. But the belief never fully disappears. Even into the Enlightenment, trepanning remains an option because when you don't know how the brain works, the temptation to physically intervene is strong. And this leads us gently toward the modern era, where trepanning transforms into something that looks more scientific, but is still deeply questionable. Humans are still confused, still anxious, and still deeply uncomfortable with anything happening inside the brain. But now they have confidence, and historically, that's when things get dangerous. By the 1600s and 1700s, medicine begins to wear a cleaner outfit. Doctors write books, sketch diagrams, argue in Latin, and call themselves rational. And trepanning somehow survives the upgrade. It's no longer framed as releasing spirits. Now it's about pressure, circulation, and balance. Much more respectable words, much easier to defend at conferences. Surgeons begin to describe the skull as a rigid container. The brain swells, pressure builds, so obviously you make space. This logic isn't completely wrong, which is why it's so persistent. In cases of severe head trauma, relieving pressure can save lives. Modern neurosurgery still does this very carefully with imaging, sterile rooms, and people who went to school for a long time. But early modern doctors didn't have scans. They had symptoms and a lot of enthusiasm. So trepanning expands again. Headaches, vertigo, melancholy, hysteria, which unsurprisingly mostly applied to women. If a patient complained too much, cried too often, or expressed sadness without a clear external reason, something was wrong inside the head, and heads, by now, were very drillable. Melancholy becomes a key player. It is the early modern catch-all for depression, anxiety, and existential despair, which honestly sounds like a very accurate word. Doctors believe melancholy comes from excess black bile, or poor blood flow, or stagnation of spirits in the brain. And once again, the answer is a hole. The logic stays consistent even as the explanations evolve. What's interesting is that some patients report feeling better afterwards. Less pressure, less pain, less anxiety. But this part has to be said quietly. Pain, trauma, and shock can temporarily alter perception, and if someone expects relief, their brain often delivers it. Placebo is powerful, especially when combined with survival. Then the story drifts into the 19th century, where things should get better. They do not. This is the era of industrialization, asylums, institutions, and a growing population of people labeled mentally unwell. Doctors are overwhelmed. Society wants solutions, quiet solutions, and once again, the brain becomes the battlefield. Trepanning itself becomes less common, but its philosophy lives on. If behavior is inconvenient, change the brain. This is where we meet procedures that feel like trepanning's descendants: cranial drilling to relieve madness, experimental surgeries, electrotherapy, ice baths and isolation, and eventually the lobotomy.
Lobotomies aren't trepanning exactly, but spiritually they're cousins. Same mindset, different tools. The most infamous name here is Walter Freeman, a man who looks at overcrowded mental hospitals and decides speed is the solution. He doesn't drill holes in skulls the old way. He slides instruments behind the eye socket. No operating room, no anesthesia beyond sedation, no surgical training, just confidence and a belief that damaged brains are easier to manage. And once again, some patients seem calmer afterward, quieter,
less distressed, but also less themselves, which institutions consider a success. This is where the story circles back to Trepannings's core truth. It was never just about healing, it was about control. Control over bodies, over minds, over people who didn't fit comfortably into their time. When society didn't know how to help, it chose to intervene anyway. By the mid-20th century, things finally begin to shift. Neuroscience advances, psychiatry evolves, medication emerges, and trepanning, real, literal skull drilling, becomes a historical artifact, mostly. Because there's always an exception. In the 1960s and 70s, a small group of counterculture thinkers revived trepanning as a path to enlightenment. They believed that as children, humans have higher brain blood volume. Adulthood reduces it, and a whole might restore it. This theory has no evidence, but it has passion. One man, Joe Mellon, drills his own skull at home with a dental drill. He survives, which immediately convinces others this is a great idea. He reports clarity, expanded consciousness, improved perception. Doctors report concern. And yet trepanning enters the fringes of modern culture with small groups, internet forums, and people insisting it unlocks something ancient and lost. Which brings us to the quiet ending of the story. Trepanning never truly disappears because it represents something deeply human. The refusal to sit with uncertainty, the need to do something. When pain has no explanation, when the mind feels wrong, when suffering doesn't respond to prayer or patience, humans reach for tools. Sometimes those tools help, sometimes they harm, and sometimes they just make us feel less helpless. Looking back, it's easy to judge ancient people for drilling skulls with rocks, but they were working with what they had: fear, belief, hope, and the idea that suffering must have a physical solution. Today, we know more. We scan brains instead of opening them. We treat illness with care instead of holes. But the impulse remains: to fix, to intervene, to believe that one decisive action will quiet the chaos inside the head. Trepanning's story isn't really about medicine. It's about discomfort with not knowing. And that quietly connects us to every person who ever sat very still while someone promised them they'd feel better after this. Way back, past kings, past castles, past paperwork and taxes, all the way into the Ice Age. And no worries, this is not going to be loud, dramatic, or full of jump scares. No roaring mammoths bursting through the walls. Just humans. Cold humans, slightly hungry humans, but humans who, surprisingly, had hobbies. Because despite what old cartoons and dusty textbooks told us, cavemen were not just grunting, club-swinging chaos machines. They weren't all forehead and no thoughts. They were, in fact, artistic, musical, emotional, sometimes deeply bored, and occasionally sitting in a freezing cave thinking, you know what this wall needs? Vibes. So tonight, we're gently unpacking the sophisticated art and music of the Ice Age, the people who painted masterpieces by torchlight, carved tiny sculptures with numb fingers, and somehow found time for creativity while also trying not to freeze to death. Truly inspirational. Now, let's clear something up. When we say cavemen, we're not talking about one single group of people who all lived in caves wearing the same fur outfit from a low-budget movie. We're talking about many different human groups spread across Europe, Asia, and beyond, mostly during the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 40,000 to 10,000 years ago. These people were anatomically modern humans, same brains as us, same emotional range, same capacity for art, music, and probably complaining about their neighbors. The only major difference is that their neighbors might have been Neanderthals, or wolves, or both. And yes, some of them lived in caves, but not because caves were trendy. Caves were practical. They were dry. They blocked wind. They didn't collapse as easily as a hut made of sticks and optimism. But most people actually lived in open camps and only used caves for special purposes, which is important because the caves with art, those weren't just homes, they were something else, almost like galleries. Now imagine this. You've walked miles through snow. Your shoes are basically feelings at this point. You finally reach a cave. Inside, it's dark. The walls are uneven. The air smells of smoke and damp stone. Someone lights a torch. The shadows flicker, and suddenly the walls come alive. Bison, horses, mammoths, lions, painted with motion, depth, and confidence. Some overlap each other. Some look like they're running. Some are outlined, shaded, textured. This is not finger painting while bored. This is deliberate, skilled, thought out. And the wild part is, most of this art was never meant to be seen casually. Cave paintings like those at Lascaux or Chauvet are often deep inside caves, not near the entrance, not somewhere convenient. You have to crawl, climb, squeeze through narrow passages, bring light, bring tools, commit to the journey. Which tells us something very calm and very important. These people weren't decorating their living room. They were doing something intentional, possibly spiritual, possibly ceremonial, possibly just very committed to interior design. And yes, historians have spent decades arguing about what it all means. Hunting magic, religious ritual, shamanic visions, early storytelling.
Or maybe, just maybe, someone really liked drawing horses and had no sketchbook. The truth is, it was probably a mix. Humans rarely do things for just one reason. Even now, we say things like, "I just like it," while secretly processing 15 emotional layers underneath. One of the most fascinating things about Ice Age art is how accurate it is. These people understood animal anatomy deeply. They knew how muscles moved, how legs bent, how bodies carried weight. This wasn't guesswork, this was observation. Which makes sense. If your survival depends on knowing exactly how a bison moves when it's annoyed, you pay attention. But what's extra impressive is the technique. They used mineral pigments, ochre, charcoal, manganese. They mixed them with animal fat, saliva, water, whatever worked. They blew pigment through hollow bones. They used brushes made from hair or moss. They engraved lines into stone. This is chemistry. This is planning. This is someone saying, okay, if I mix this red rock with fat, it sticks better. Noted. Very scientific, very calm, very not what we were promised by cartoons. And then there are the handprints. You've probably seen them. Pale hand silhouettes sprayed onto cave walls. Some are adult, some are children. Some are missing fingers, which has caused endless speculation. Ritual amputation, frostbite, symbolic gestures, or just fingers tucked in while spraying pigment. No one knows, which is oddly soothing. A reminder that some mysteries are allowed to stay mysteries. You don't need to solve everything to appreciate it. Now, let's gently slide over to something even quieter. Music. Because yes, Ice Age humans made music. Not just noise, music. We've found flutes carved from bird bones and mammoth ivory, dating back over 35,000 years. Proper instruments, carefully shaped holes, tuned spacing, designed to produce specific notes. Which means someone sat there, carving bone, testing sound, adjusting placement, and thinking, no, that hole's too close. That's sharp. That's better. That's a musician. That's a composer. That's not someone randomly whistling while waiting for dinner. And imagine the scene. A small group huddled around a fire. Outside, the world is cold and dangerous. Inside, someone plays a slow melody. Not for survival, not to scare predators, just because. Music doesn't help you hunt. It doesn't keep you warm.
It doesn't fix a broken spear. It exists for emotional reasons, for connection, for expression, for passing time when the sun sets at 4 in the afternoon and you're very done with the day. Which tells us something important. These people weren't just surviving, they were living. They laughed, they grieved, they told stories. They made jokes that are now tragically lost to time. Probably a lot of jokes about mammoths. And art wasn't limited to caves. They carved figurines, tiny sculptures, animals, abstract shapes, and yes, the famous Venus figurines. These small statues of women with exaggerated features, wide hips, large breasts, rounded bellies. For a long time, people made weird assumptions about them. Fertility idols, mother goddesses, ancient pinups, all very dramatic. But again, reality is probably simpler. These figures were about life, survival, continuity, maybe beauty, maybe identity, maybe self-portraiture. Some scholars even think women carved them themselves, which would be a very calm correction to centuries of assumptions. What matters is this. These people were thinking symbolically, abstractly, emotionally. They were capable of representation and metaphor, which is a big deal. That's the same mental toolkit that eventually gives us poetry, philosophy, and very long YouTube documentaries you fall asleep to. Now, let's address the stereotype directly. The idea that prehistoric humans were stupid. They weren't. They adapted to extreme climates. They developed clothing, tools, social structures, trade networks. They remembered landscapes, tracked seasons, passed down knowledge orally for thousands of years. That's not primitive, that's sophisticated without paperwork. And maybe the reason we underestimated them so long is because they didn't leave behind written records. No king's lists, no tax logs complaining about grain shortages, just art, music, objects, quiet things. And quiet things are easy to ignore if you're only listening for noise. So, as we settle into this story, just let that sink in. The Ice Age wasn't just a grim survival slog. It was also filled with creativity, with moments of stillness, with people standing in front of a wall, torch flickering, adding one more line to a painting that would outlast empires. In the next part, we'll gently drift deeper into the social lives of these early artists, who they were, how they lived together, and why cooperation, not brute force, was the real secret weapon of Ice Age humanity. But for now, just rest here. Cold outside, fire inside, a soft flute playing somewhere in the dark. Same fire, same slow rhythm, nothing urgent. The mammoths are still doing whatever mammoths do, and we are once again sitting very calmly in the Ice Age, where survival was hard, but social skills were harder. Because if there's one thing Ice Age humans absolutely mastered, quietly, patiently, without writing it down, it was living together without completely falling apart. Which is impressive. Even today, put 5 people in a group chat and things go sideways within minutes. Ice Age communities were small, usually bands of maybe 20 to 40 people. Extended families, friends, people who had known each other forever, people who absolutely knew each other's annoying habits. And yet, they managed. They hunted together, shared food, raised children collectively, took care of the sick and injured. And yes, they did this without group therapy, productivity apps, or motivational posters. Now, these groups were nomadic. They moved with the seasons, following animals, following plants, following weather patterns they understood deeply because their lives depended on it. And when you're moving constantly, you don't carry junk. Everything you own matters. Tools are maintained, clothing is repaired, knowledge is shared verbally, carefully, generation after generation. Which means memory was everything. elders mattered a lot. Not because they were powerful in a flashy way, but because they remembered things. Where herds migrated, which plants were safe, when the rivers flooded, which winters were especially bad. An old person wasn't a burden, they were a walking archive, which already flips another stereotype on its head. And this kind of social structure creates something very important: trust. You don't survive the Ice Age alone. You survive because someone else watches your back while you sleep, because someone shares food when your hunt fails, because someone carries you when you're injured. Archaeological evidence shows healed fractures that would have been fatal without long-term care. So when we see someone with a healed broken leg from 30,000 years ago, what we're really seeing is kindness, patience, time spent helping someone who couldn't immediately contribute. Very unbrutish behavior. And this social glue is exactly what made art and music possible. You can't create symbolic culture if everyone's constantly at war with each other. You need moments of calm, safety, shared meaning. Which brings us back to storytelling. Because before writing, before books, before annoying pop-up ads, there were stories, told by firelight, repeated, refined, remembered. Stories explained the world, why the sun moved, why animals behaved the way they did, why people died, why some places felt important. Stories gave structure to uncertainty. And here's the thing: art and music likely worked alongside those stories. Cave paintings weren't just images, they were memory aids, visual anchors for tales passed down orally. Imagine someone pointing at a painted bison and saying, slowly, calmly, "This is the winter when the herd turned back. This is where we learned not to follow." That's education, without classrooms, without notes, just shared attention. And this also explains why cave art is often layered, paintings added over time, generations contributing, no concern for ruining the original, because it wasn't about ownership, it was about continuity. Very anti-museum behavior, very human. Now, let's float gently over to another misunderstood idea: violence. Yes, Ice Age life was dangerous. Predators existed. Accidents happened. People died young sometimes. But the idea that early humans were constantly fighting each other is exaggerated. There's surprisingly little evidence of large-scale warfare in the Upper Paleolithic. No mass graves filled with weapons, no fortifications, no organized armies. Conflicts happened, sure, humans are humans, but cooperation was far more valuable than domination. A wounded enemy is still a wounded human who knows things you might need later. And small groups don't benefit from endless fighting. You need every capable adult, every skilled hunter, every experienced gatherer. Burning bridges gets cold very fast in the Ice Age, which makes their calmness feel earned. Now let's talk about children, because Ice Age kids were not just tiny adults with spears. Childhood existed. We know this from footprints, handprints, toys, miniature tools, practice carvings. Children learned by watching and copying, by playing, by being gently corrected. And yes, some of the handprints in caves are definitely children's, which means kids were brought into these spaces. They weren't hidden away. They were part of the cultural world. Imagine being a child, holding a torch, watching an adult paint an animal that seems to move in the flickering light. That's formative. That stays with you. And speaking of light, fire was central to everything. Fire meant warmth, protection, cooking, but also gathering. Fire creates a focal point, a circle, a place where people sit facing each other. Firelight softens things, shadows dance, faces glow, time slows down, which makes it perfect for music, stories, and quiet rituals. And rituals existed. We know this because of burials. Ice Age burials weren't random. People were placed carefully, sometimes with grave goods, tools, ornaments, red ochre sprinkled over the body, flowers possibly, meaningful positioning. That's not panic, that's intention. That's someone saying, this person mattered, which again points to emotional depth, grief, memory, love. Not bad for people we once called primitive. Now, let's briefly touch on clothing, because yes, fashion existed. Clothing was functional, obviously, warmth first, but it was also decorated. Beads, pendants, teeth, shells, pigments. People signaled identity through what they wore. Group membership, status, achievements, personal taste. Which means even in the Ice Age, someone was absolutely judging someone else's outfit, silently, calmly, by the fire. And these ornaments were often made with extreme care, tiny beads drilled with stone tools, strung together, worn close to the body. Time-consuming, delicate. You don't do that unless you value beauty, or meaning, or both. And then there's music again, because it keeps coming back. Music likely helped coordinate movement, ritual, dance. Yes, dance. Rhythmic movement brings groups together, synchronizes breathing, heart rates, emotions, which is why humans still do it at weddings, concerts, even awkward office parties. So imagine a slow rhythm, a drum made from skin, a flute echoing softly, feet moving in patterns learned over time. Nothing frantic, just steady, grounding. A reminder that you're part of something larger than yourself. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from Ice Age culture. These people understood interdependence deeply, not as an abstract concept, but as daily reality. Your survival was tied to others. Your knowledge was shared. Your art belonged to the group. Your stories lived on only if someone else remembered them, which creates humility, patience, a long view of time. They didn't rush. They couldn't. Seasons dictated pace. Nature set the schedule. You learned to wait, to observe, to adapt. And that slow mindset is embedded in their art, in the careful lines, the layered paintings, the enduring symbols. So when we look at Ice Age art today, we're not just seeing images, we're seeing evidence of stable communities, of emotional intelligence, of people who figured out that being gentle with each other was a survival strategy. In the next part, we'll drift into the minds of these artists themselves, how they may have thought, how symbolism shaped their inner worlds, and why imagination might have been humanity's quiet superpower long before cities existed. But for now, stay warm, stay still, let the fire crackle softly. This is the last stretch, with no new characters and no surprises, just a slow and quiet walk toward the end of the firelight where the story naturally begins to fade. By now, we've spent enough time with Ice Age humans to understand something important about them. They weren't rushing anywhere. They didn't live in a world of deadlines, alarms, or constant updates. Their lives moved at the pace of seasons, animal migrations, and the gradual lengthening and shortening of daylight. Living that way changes how the mind works, because when you're not constantly distracted, your thoughts go deeper, stretch outward, and begin to search for meaning beyond what's immediately visible. This is where symbolism begins. Ice Age humans didn't just see animals as physical creatures. A bison wasn't only food. It represented power, danger, survival, memory, the success of past hunts, and the loss of those who didn't return. When they painted animals, they weren't simply recording reality, they were processing it, which is deeply human. Holding ideas in the mind that aren't physically present is the foundation of imagination, belief, planning, and identity. You can't create art unless you can picture something before it exists, and you can't tell stories unless you understand time as something fluid. Ice Age humans clearly did. Their art wasn't random. Certain animals appear repeatedly, certain locations were reused, and certain symbols returned again and again. Dots, lines, shapes, and marks that don't directly represent anything tangible point toward abstract thought, calm, intentional, and advanced. This abstract thinking likely shaped how they understood themselves. They were no longer just bodies moving through the cold, but parts of a lineage, a group, a story that began before them and would continue after. They belonged not only to a place geographically, but spiritually as well. That sense of belonging made fear manageable. The Ice Age was filled with danger, storms, predators, illness, injury, and loss. But belief systems, even very simple ones, help humans cope with uncertainty. Ritual creates predictability. Art creates permanence. Music regulates emotion, and stories offer explanations when facts are unavailable. None of this requires formal religion, only shared understanding. Red ochre in burials shows comfort. Carefully positioned bodies show respect, and objects placed with the dead suggest hope or memory. And memory is everything. Nothing written survives unless someone remembers to write it down, but spoken stories, repeated enough, can last longer than stone. This brings us to language. We don't know what Ice Age languages sounded like, but they existed, complex enough to convey instructions, emotions, jokes, and probably gossip. Language allows nuance, metaphor, and humor. Humans have always had dry comments, exaggerations, and quiet eye rolls. These moments don't fossilize, but they absolutely happened. Through language, imagination spreads. One person dreams something, another remembers it, and another adds to it. Over generations, shared ideas grow richer, and that is culture. Not built overnight, not imposed from above, but layered slowly, like cave paintings themselves. For most of human history, far longer than cities or kings or writing, this was our world. Small groups, shared resources, deep connection to environment, and time measured in moons instead of minutes. In that world, art and music weren't luxuries, they were tools. Tools for bonding, teaching, and emotional balance. Modern life treats creativity as optional, something reserved for spare time. But Ice Age humans didn't divide life that way. Work flowed into rest, rest into ritual, ritual into story, and story into identity. Their art still feels powerful because it wasn't made for audiences, profit, or legacy. It existed because it needed to exist. And maybe that's why it has lasted. We often imagine progress as a straight line, as if humans were bad at being human until recently. But the Ice Age tells a different story. We didn't become human when we built cities or invented writing. We became human when we sat together in the dark and made something that didn't need to exist. A song, a painting, a story. These things don't feed you or keep you warm, but they feed something internal, something that still exists today. The instinct that drew someone tens of thousands of years ago to carve a flute from bone and play it softly while the world outside froze is the same instinct that continues to shape us now.